From Wana Brands, welcome to Enhance Your Life. I'm your host, Jonathan Small, and each week I talk to people from all sorts of professions and backgrounds about how cannabis has enhanced their lives and how this healing plant can enrich your life too. Hey everybody, welcome to the Enhance Your Life podcast. My name is John Small and I am your host. We have an incredible guest today. Jay Shifman joins us. And Jay has just an incredible story to share. He survived 2 suicide attempts as well as an overdose before turning his life around and starting a company called Choose Your Struggle, which is dedicated to promoting education about mental health and drug policies. And of course, cannabis has played a big role in Jay's recovery, and he's here to tell us all about it. Jay, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much. And I will say that any time that my intro includes my supreme support for better cannabis policy and cannabis use, I know it's going to be a wonderful conversation.
Well, we're all about that here. So we're going to have a great conversation. Let's start with your origin story here. I know that you've struggled with mental health your whole life. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that led to sort of the suicide attempts and the overdose?
Yeah, so the very quick version, because I've done a half an hour version of this and we're not going to do that one today, is I am a guy who has struggled with my mental health, depression, anxiety, ADHD, and OCD are kind of the big ones. Unfortunately for me, all of that was starting to rear its head when I was a preteen. And if you remember what else happens when you're a preteen, it's puberty, and that's not fun for anybody. And then you add on top of that my therapist started treating me for ADHD, and this was the late 90s when a lot of these medications were being developed. And so that, in full equation created a perfect storm that unfortunately for me, my therapist saw, and instead of recognizing it for what it was, decided to give it a new name. He called it a mood disorder and eventually changed that later in my teens to bipolar disorder. Now, that's a very serious issue of mental health. Really so much love and support to everybody who has bipolar disorder. I don't. And when you give someone who doesn't have those issues or that diagnosis the medication for it, things aren't going to go well. And it did not for me. So by my early 20s, I was struggling with full-blown addiction to at least a couple of the medications I was on every day, which were more than 5, by the way. I was taking 6, sometimes 7 different medications every single day, and misusing all the other ones. I mean, I was a mess. I was also misusing a lot of other substances, and where cannabis really comes into this is that I was smoking a lot of cannabis just to help me relax, right? Because my state of being at the time was all the way up here. You know what I mean? I was on so many medications that I was just in an awful place. And honestly, the only thing that made me feel better was cannabis. And then when I wanted to get out of my head for a while, I was using a lot of psilocybin as well. So those were really my go-tos. It's hard for me sometimes to talk to people who don't understand that and just see all drugs as, that kind of nonsense, right? Because that wasn't my experience, and quite the opposite. The legal ones were the ones that were really putting me in a bad spot. And the illegal ones, cannabis and psilocybin, were the ones that were keeping me on my feet and keeping me sane.
Wow.
So that was sort of my early 20s, and that led to the lowest points, which were the suicide attempts.
Yeah. And I read in your bio that you tried twice in the course of 2 days to commit suicide.
Yeah, and in fact, it was roughly 24 hours. So it was one night and then again the next night. The second night, I succeeded in sending myself into overdose on my prescription pills. And the really unfortunate thing about that, if overdose wasn't unfortunate enough, was that because this is our country and this happens way too often, when my friend called 911, a police car showed up at my door. And the last thing I remember before going into full-blown overdose and blacking out was being put in handcuffs and roughly thrown against the side of a cop car, having my head bounced off the side, and then being thrown in the back seat where I black out. So that was a really rough night. Obviously, I spent the night handcuffed to a hospital bed.
Wow.
And came to the next day in a lockdown unit, in a hospital ward. Spent 3 weeks there, followed by 3 months in a long-term care facility, what we would have called a mental institution 50 years ago. And it was there that I really realized what was going on with me, because I got to know people with bipolar disorder and people that were struggling with addiction. And I saw that first group and said, man, like I said, I have so much love for you, but that's not me. Isn't what's happening with me. But this group, that I recognize. And I ended up checking myself out and going to live with my grandmother in Sedona, Arizona, outside of Sedona, and going through step-down detox. And in the spring of 2010, I finally got in, or for the first time in over a decade and, 13 years, I had nothing left in my system, and I kind of restarted my life there.
Wow. What a story. So you were misdiagnosed, given these drugs, and these drugs were did they ever help, or did they were so at odds with each other? It sounds like it just made you just completely unstable, right? And anxious and depressed and everything all at once.
That's such a hard question to answer, because overall, obviously, you've now heard, the abridged version of my story. Of course they didn't help. That being said, I can't say that they didn't do anything, because I was in such a terrible place that, like, as bad as that story is, maybe it's even worse if I'm only on 3 of the, it's really hard to split those apart. Obviously, though, as I've now sort of referenced, the things that I do look back and say that were so helpful was cannabis and psilocybin. Those were the two that I can say, without those, I don't know if I get through this period.
Yeah. So let's talk about that period when you after rehab, and you said you moved in with your grandparents. At that point, what were you were completely clean of the pharmaceutical drugs, but you were still partaking in cannabis and psilocybin just to manage
Here's what's ridiculous. When I was at the mental institution, we'll call it what it is, I actually have my journal from that period, because I'm working with a co-author on a book about my story and other things. And I laughed to myself reading this. I got an award, or I got acknowledged at this institution for my sobriety, right? They applauded me for not smoking, for not drinking and all this. And yet here I am taking so many pills every single day, struggling with addiction, but they were willing to call that sober, right?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of mindset that I was in at the time. When I got into recovery in the spring of 2010, I spent the next period, let's say 3, 4, or 5 months, so sober that I was even beyond AA's definition, right? Because AA allows you to smoke cigarettes and drink coffee. I did nothing. For 3, 4, or 5 months, something like that. And then I started trying to go, okay, I know I had problems with prescription pills, but I was dependent on the cannabis for sure. It was keeping me on my feet, but I was never addicted to it, because that's not a thing. So let me try that again. And of course that went well. Okay, I would never had a problem with alcohol. I'm sure I could drink again, and I did. So that was the next period, was kind of rediscovering my relationship with substances one by one, until I got to the point that I am now, obviously 12 years later, where I strongly believe in cannabis and the powers of that. I do microdose. My wife and I are both big believers in that. And I can have a healthy relationship with alcohol and coffee, obviously, but those are pretty much the only things that I do now. I also am in the mindset now that if you can use a substance safely, far be it from me to tell you not to, right? I mean, that is my relationship with substances. I think it's very personal for every person.
Yeah, we've said this on the show a lot, that it really, cannabis, I mean, all drugs are very personal. I want to talk about, you just mentioned that you microdose cannabis, because I was curious how you consume cannabis now and what your sort of self-care routine is with cannabis. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sorry, I misspoke there. I microdose psilocybin and smoke cannabis.
Okay.
So cannabis, I'm really lucky with my work, Choose Your Struggle, that one of my partners is the CBD company Roadrunner out in New Mexico. And they are like, when you talk about self-care, that is part of my self-care. I do smoke a good amount of CBD and also high THC flower. And I love mixing the two. I love going to the dispensary and trying new things and putting them with the CBD. That's what really makes me happy. I grew for the first time since I was in college this year, thanks to my buddy at Roadrunner, Kyle Blanks. Shout out to Kyle Blanks. And then psilocybin, I grew myself because I didn't want to get into the dangers of trying to buy it somewhere with unsafe supply. So I grew it myself, and that's what we use.
Yeah. And then you take that as you microdose the psilocybin. I just had
Correct.
lunch with a guy today, actually, who was telling me that he has been doing that. And really, it's been enhancing his life quite a bit. But in a very, what might be like one dose, if you want to trip, he's taking like a 15th of that. And I guess you're doing a similar type of thing.
Yeah, so for literal numbers, the average person trips off of, if you are low tolerance like me, by the way, I have a baby tolerance for everything. You can start feeling those effects around 1.5 grams. I have friends who are just, the Iron Giant, and they can take up to 4 grams and then start to feel it. That's a lot. Yeah. Usually it's 1.5 to 3, somewhere in there is you'll start to feel the effects. For a microdose, we're talking a tenth of that. So for me, that's 0.1. Yeah. That's what my wife and I take. For some people, it's up to 0.3, but these are very small amounts.
Yeah. And what are the effects for you?
So for me, the psilocybin acts as the best mood stabilizer I've ever been on. And as you heard from my story, I've tried them all. But for me, part of my self-care is that I rate my mood every day. And since I started doing the microdose thing back in June, I think that's when I started, you can look on the data that this app gives me. And over that period, my average mood has been increased by about a point out of 5. So we're talking serious impacts. Yeah. And what I tend to tell people is that it sort of acts as a shield in my brain. I still feel things. Perfect example is right now my wife and I are finishing or going through the process of buying a house, which, as everyone knows, is just incredibly stressful.
Especially now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And so of course I'm still stressed out by this, right? But in the past, where that is on a scale of 1 to 5, if 5 is the best and 1 is the worst, maybe a 1.5 or a 2 right now because of how stressful this is, between a 2 and a 3. It's still getting to me, but not as strongly. I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So now this sort of this cocktail of sorts that you figured out with psilocybin and cannabis and the occasional drink here and there and coffee has really stabilized. Was really the sort of medicine that you needed to really deal with the issues that you were dealing with before and are dealing with now, right?
Yeah, so I would say that there's one addendum to that, and that is that back when I was at my worst, I was being taught by my therapist that the answer to these feelings was these pills, right? If I didn't like the way I was feeling, I would just take a handful of pills. That was my go-to. Now I know how to deal with these things outside of the substances, and then the substances come along as sort of the added on piece of it instead of the go-to, right? So I have a very robust, self-care package, of which these substances are a part, of course, but they're not the end-all be-all the way that they were before. And so in that way, I have a much more mindful, much more healthy relationship with substances than I did 10 years ago.
So let's talk about what Choose Your Struggle does. And first, let's talk about why you decided to start this organization.
Well, it came from in 2015. I was 5 years into recovery, and I finally felt healthy. It took me 5 years for my brain, my maturity, my bodily health, all of that to catch up with each other, because I'd been on medication for almost a decade and a half. And I started to feel that I was healthy. And while I know that I will always be a guy in recovery, I felt recovered, if that makes sense. So there was an opportunity in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm from, to tell my story on stage. And I said no a couple of times. And when I finally said yes, that's the night Choose Your Struggle was born. And what it really means is that when I was at my worst, I lost the ability to get up every day and choose what I was going to fight for, right? It was just to stay a person, to stay alive, to avoid withdrawals. Those were my struggles.
Yeah.
But now that I was healthy again, I got to choose again. What was I going to fight for? And I decided that my fight was going to be to help those struggling with substance misuse, addiction, and mental health. So I did this on the side for the next 3 years until late 2018. when I decided that I was ready to take this full time. And so in January of 2019, I launched Choose Your Struggle from my side gig to my full-time thing. And that is what it's been now for the last 3 years.
So when you say you help people, tell me how it works.
Well, so I've done everything from coaching and consulting. I've worked with some businesses on the way that they can provide better employee engagement around mental health and substance misuse. And I like doing those. My team would probably wish that I would do more of those because those are the big money makers, right?
Yeah.
But me personally, the ones that I really love doing are the stuff that I'm really focused on now. That's the podcast Choose Your Struggle, which interviews people with lived and learned experiences on these topics to help end stigma and promote honest and fact-based education. We have another podcast dropping in the spring called Made It, which is a serial, much more of an episodic podcast focused on somebody like myself who's gone through trauma, has come back to make something.
Yeah.
And season 1 is focused on a woman named Sarah Laurel, who started an organization here in Philadelphia. I do virtual storytelling events. These are called Rock Bottom Storytellers, where 4 people who've lived through trauma come on and talk about their downfall, but more importantly, what that actually felt like at the bottom. Because when people like me tell my story or tell our stories, we often sort of skim over that bottom part and then leave people feeling inspired, which is very important. That comeback is incredibly important. But when you do that, you minimize the actual struggle of that story. And so we really focus on that with these events. I've got a book coming out next year. The big picture answer to that is really helping to end the stigma and promoting honest and fact-based education, because for far too long, everything we were taught about addiction, about mental health, about drug use was coming from this place of both intentional and unintentional, we'll call it what it is, lies.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I try to do is promoting honest and fact-based education around these topics.
Well, what would you like to see change, certainly in the drug policies of this country, locally and federally, so that other people don't end up in the situation that you found yourself in?
Well, that's a great question, and one I wish I got asked more than I do. I gave a TED Talk back in June that told my story briefly and then helped people see that the reason guys like me didn't get the help we need was that the way that we have been conditioned, again, both unintentionally and intentionally, to see those who struggle both with substance misuse and addiction, but even more broadly, just who used drugs, is as these sort of subhumans, right? The way we talk about drug users is in some ways animalistic, and that is not unintentional. If you go back to the history of the war on drugs, it was based in racism. It was based in
the reefer
sexism.
madness period. Yeah.
Oh, so yes, I mean, that's a great example. Even before that, we're talking the late 1800s when they were passing laws that specifically outlawed smokable opium because the white Westerners in mostly California were afraid of the Chinese immigrants mingling with white women. I mean, it's right there in the laws and the way they talk about it. So when you understand that, the way we've talked about people like me forever is as undeserving of help, then you can go, oh, that's why our treatment systems are broken. That's why these places are nefarious for terrible actions and really not using the current thinking around science and around health. These are sort of get them in, get them sober, kick them out, and, well, we'll see what happens. That's like 80% of the treatment centers. And it's because if we don't think of them as humans, well, then we don't have to give them humane treatment, right?
Yeah.
So you have to understand this history, because that history, even though you would be really hard pressed to find somebody who would still say that, whether they're an elected official or a treatment provider, that is the foundation all of this is built on. And until you can get rid of that foundation, we can't fix what's going on today.
Did you find that kind of animalistic, you mentioned, treatment when you were in the rehab that you went to for 3 months? Was that really
100%?
So you just felt like
so I'll tell you the one that blows people's minds. If you've ever seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there's a really classic scene where they do quote unquote group treatment, and they all sit around in a circle and they pick at one particular person. And I couldn't even tell you now the scientific thought behind why that was helpful. people think that's ancient history. It's not. I was in there in this place in late 2009. I had that happen to me. That was still done just over a decade ago. So there is no rational reason to do that to a person. I mean, the degrading things people were allowed to say to people in this moment were just shocking. Yeah. And yet it was allowed because it was quote unquote treatment.
Wow. What your experience with cannabis, I just want to get back to that since this is Enhance Your Life and it's about cannabis. What does it amaze you still that it's federally illegal? I mean, based on all the other, drugs that you've taken in your life, do you find cannabis to be somewhat harmless and actually helpful?
Yeah, but unfortunately for us, we've never really led with health, right? I mean, that's not, as we were just talking about, that's not where any of this is coming from. Yeah, it's all coming from these horrible stigmas, and it's not shocking to me because obviously, and I'm sure you've had people on your show talk about this before, but the guy in the White House right now wrote a lot of these horrible laws, so it's not shocking. What is shocking to me is that there hasn't been. I'll put it this way. So I live in Philadelphia. I love the local paper called the Tribune. It's the sort of alternative paper to the main Enquirer. And just last week, there was a column by a guy who writes about quote unquote fitness. And he uses that word very broadly, but all about how evil cannabis was and about how from top to bottom, he just made shit up. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to cuss. It was all made up. I mean, he claimed that it rots your teeth, that it will make you hallucinate, all this stuff that we know is just straight out of reefer madness, like you were saying, right? And yet, I've reached out now to the paper's publishers to be like, guys, like, this is a problem. This is made up. I know this. I read these studies. There is nothing that says this. And in fact, if there is, I would like to read it because I've never heard these claims and I've heard nothing. I've also seen no retractions. I've seen no letters to the editors. People took this as hook, line, and sinker.
Wow.
And that
seems
scares
such a dated,
me because it's made up. It was completely made up.
Made up and just perpetuating the stigma that you're trying to. So I guess the way you counter that is that you get your message out there, which is one of hope and health and more of a positive message. I mean, do you think that people can get addicted to cannabis or? Well,
so I love that you asked that question because this gives me a chance to talk about something that a lot of people say is splitting hairs, but I disagree. So there's a difference between addiction and dependence. So addiction, for those who don't know, is a medical term. It is. I have the diagnostic manual sitting not far from me. That's the book that doctors use for when it comes to mental health stuff to give people a diagnosis, right? That is a medical term, and you have to hit certain points to be given that qualification. Now, as Dr. Carl Hart, who, by the way, if your listeners, if you don't know Carl Hart, please go read Carl Hart, one of my heroes. As he's shown recently, the number of substance users who will end up struggling with addiction is actually very small. It's roughly 4%. Now, there's a difference between addiction and substance misuse, which is binge drinking, if you're smoking, even cannabis, all day, every day, and it's keeping you from living your life. That's a problem, but you're not addicted to it. You don't go into withdrawal if you stop.
Right.
Now, what you might have, as I did back in the day, is a dependence on it. I could not stop because mentally I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't have my cannabis around. That's dependence, but that is not addiction. And addiction is what I was going through with those pills, where when I stopped, I spent the morning curled around my bathroom floor because I was puking my guts out. That is a very different experience than just, I am scared of what will happen if I don't smoke today.
Yeah. So what has cannabis meant in your life? Tell me what it's meant.
Oh, man. To me, it's meant health. It's meant relaxation. It's meant community, I think, is a really important word because I'm a big whiskey fan. I love whiskey. My wife and I do the whiskey tours and all that kind of stuff. But there's a different experience sitting there having a glass of whiskey, which is very enjoyable, don't get me wrong, and passing a joint around, right? Very different experiences. And given the choice, I would do the latter. I think that there's a communal part that comes with cannabis use that does not Nobody sits around and has really great conversations on Bud Light. If you do, I apologize. I don't mean to color you that way. But that is the more a normal experience or more regular experience, in my opinion, or my experience with cannabis. So to me, those are the big three. Is that it helps me relax. I am a guy with anxiety, and it really helps me relax. It helps me feel good if I've had, say, too much to drink, or even if I've got a cold and I just need to feel a little bit better. I reach for my cannabis. But the most important one is it's community. It allows me to connect with others in a really beautiful way.
Yeah. Well, if people want to, you have so many things you're doing. I almost don't know where to point people, but they can certainly listen to your podcast, which we didn't mention in the intro. Tell me a little bit. So tell me how they can listen to your podcast.
So Choose Your Struggles second season just ended in early November of 2021. And third season will kick off in probably February. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Search for Choose Your Struggle. Go subscribe. I'm really lucky that, so my background's public speaking. That's what I do. That's my normal thing. But because of COVID, obviously, I haven't had the chance to do that as much over the last couple of years. And so I really sank a lot of my time into the podcast, and it's grown. I've been so lucky to chat with some amazing people around substance misuse, addiction, mental health, that kind of thing. So find that, but you can get everything you need on either chooseyourstruggle.com or jayshifman.com. That's my personal one, and my last name is Shifman. Just reach out. I'd love to hear from you. If you are a person who somehow found this podcast and doesn't believe in the powers of cannabis, I want to talk to you. Tell me how that happened. That is what I'm very curious about.
Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Enhance Your Life is brought to you by Wana, the #1 infused product in North America. Wana's entire process is designed to deliver the same great experience time after time. They have spent years fine-tuning their recipes so that their products are delicious, consistent, and potent. For more information, head on over to wanabrands.com. That's Wana, W-A-N-A, brands.com.